We're here with Jerry Bostick, legendary flight controller from NASA's mission control during Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo. Jerry went on to work on the Space Shuttle and in several top positions across NASA, Grumman Aerospace Corporation, and United Space Alliance. He served as a technical advisor to the films Apollo 13, From the Earth to the Moon, and First Man, and is author of The Kid from Golden, From the Cotton Fields of Mississippi to NASA Mission Control and Beyond. Jerry Bostick, it's a genuine honor, and thank you so much for your time today.
My pleasure.
It's really a treat. I wanted to begin at the beginning and ask you a couple of questions about the early years. What first inspired you to get involved in space exploration?
Well, I guess Sputnik in October of 1957, when I was just a freshman in college, it certainly got my attention. But my main interest in those days was not in aviation, which didn't extrapolate into space that much. My main interest was in building things. I like to work with my hands. I had, even when I was 14 years old, I built a patio on the back of my parents' home. I painted and built a 4x8, I think it was, 4-H club sign that said, "Welcome to Tishomingo County." I just like to build stuff with my hands. So, Sputnik got my interest, but it wasn't anything that I really thought I would ever, be involved in.
And when you were talking about building things with your hands, and that's what led to an interest in getting involved in space exploration after Sputnik, were there particular habits that you developed during your education years when you were going through school that helped you, sort of stay on track and stay focused?
Well, I guess my main thing there would be to pursue whatever your interests are. If you, I don't, I have trouble with kids, teenagers who say, "Well, I want to be a doctor because I can make a lot of money." I think that's entirely wrong. And I know a lot of doctors who make a lot of money and are not very happy at all. And I know a lot of people who aren't making a lot of money, but they're the happiest. So my advice is to pursue what your interests are and not pursue the money. And you will, if you're really interested in what you're doing, you'll do a wonderful job and the money will be adequate.
That's great advice, and thank you. So do what you love, follow what you're passionate about. For folks who are looking for a career in space exploration, so thinking about some content for some of the students that are out there watching this, so campers, students around the world, what are some of the top skills that students need to start acquiring if they want to become involved in space exploration?
Well, that's a great question. And I think it has changed somewhat over the years, but math always helps. In fact, I'm a math lover, a believer in math, and I think regardless of what your career choice may be, that math is a good way to start. Probably next important, or most important of all, is being able to get along with others. Because if you're an astronaut or a flight controller or whatever, your success is highly dependent on how well you can get along with others. You can't be entirely selfish and only think of yourself. Especially if we're talking about traveling all the way to Mars in a small spacecraft with 3 or 4 other people that could take up to a year, you better be able to get along with other people.
Absolutely, it's great advice. I mean, if you're needing to have those soft skills and the ability to collaborate with others, I would think that's really critical. For students who are going through school, they're basically told when to do things. So your time is pretty much managed for you. I would think that to have a career like yours, you also have to learn time management skills. Do you have any tips for students on how they can effectively kind of self-manage their own time?
Well, excuse me, I think one should always think ahead. Even when I was in high school and throughout my career, I guess, I have made notes. I would write down each day, each night, what I wanted to accomplish the next day. And I found that to be very helpful, and I still do that. You know, I'm an avid note taker.
I love that. So the notes that you take every night that outline, goals and tasks for the next day, is that something you keep like in a journal so you can refer to it later, or?
No, unfortunately, I haven't. I wish I had, but I usually just each evening I review what I had planned to do that day, and carry over the things I didn't accomplish. But I don't, unfortunately, I haven't kept the notes in a journal. I wish I had.
Indeed. Well, the habit is really useful for students to think about. And looking into, your background in mission control, Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, and beyond, and the fact that you and the team created something out of nothing. You built something as you were working on these missions. How important was creativity and flexibility during those missions and when you were putting together all of these systems?
Well, creativity was the name of the game. There was no books, no textbooks that we could go to say, here's how you fly to the moon. This is what you have to monitor on the ground. You have to track them with radar and calculate maneuvers. We had to essentially make it up as we went along. And we did that through what we call mission rules. We would think about the mission that was coming up, think our way through it, talk our way through it with all of our other flight controllers and astronauts, and try to anticipate what might happen, and then write down what we would do about it if it did happen. And that it all had to be creative because, like I said, there were no textbooks.
There's no textbooks, and so when you're writing these mission rules down, that's kind of similar to your daily task list, right? You're kind of writing a daily mission rule list for yourself.
Yep, very true.
That's kind of fun. When you were developing as a student, you mentioned you're very interested in math and very interested in building things with your hands. Was there ever a point where you decided to switch your goals? And is it okay for students today to switch their goals and change their minds about what they want to do?
Absolutely. I think it's appropriate to do that because I didn't, and I doubt if most teenagers know what they want to do for the rest of their life. So if they pursue their interests, and it turns out that that inspires them to think about other fields of endeavor, then go for it. Like I said, I wanted to build things with my hands, and so I started out in structures research, and I thought, oh man, that's really great. I want to build space structures. Well, the research part of it, I discovered I didn't like at all. It was just too vague, and I kept asking my bosses at the time, what's going to happen to this wonderful research that I'm doing? And the answer was, well, you write a NASA technical note, and then people will call you and ask you about it, and probably even ask you to visit with them and maybe design something for them. And I said, well, what if nobody calls? And they said, well, we assign you a different project, another project. So I didn't like that the approach of research at all. I wanted to work on more immediate problems.
And building on the fact that you were really fascinated with putting things together with your hands, was there a point, did you physically work on the actual consoles in mission control as well? When you were putting together these systems, how did you decide to physically structure the actual mechanisms along with creating these systems to work together and collaborate?
Well, that was just out of necessity, I guess. You know, we starting out with the launch phase, we knew that we had to track the spacecraft with ground-based radar, and we had limit lines on our big plot boards that we watched during the launch phase. And these limit lines were places that we had to call an abort if the launch vehicle got out of control and hit one of those lines, and we had to call an abort. But we just spent a lot of time thinking about what's really required to be the ground pilots, if you will, because when we started out, the Mercury spacecraft really had no computer at all and no computing capability. Gemini had very little, and even when we got into initial stages of Apollo, they could not calculate their own maneuvers on board. We had to do that on the ground. We would come up with a state vector, which is position and velocity, where the spacecraft is, how fast it's going, and what attitude it's in, and use those state vectors to calculate any maneuvers that were required to get where we're going, even, well, such as initially to rendezvous and then to do translator injection to head off toward the moon.
So when you're putting together these calculations for astronauts who are in space, could you talk a bit about your role in mission control, what you did as flight dynamics officer, like what that means, and then what you did?
Well, again, the flight dynamics officers, there were a member of the flight dynamics team. There was a retrofire officer, the flight dynamics officer, and the guidance officer. And the FIDO, the flight dynamics officer, was the team leader. But together, they tracked the spacecraft with ground-based radar, and then as onboard guidance systems developed in early Apollo, and even some in Gemini, we would compare the ground-based to the onboard guidance system and come up with the best state vector that we could. State vector being velocity and position of where the spacecraft is and the attitude it's in, and use that to calculate maneuvers ahead to accomplish the mission requirements for, like I said, initially, just to change orbits and to retrofire and then to rendezvous and do more sophisticated maneuvers like transmitter injection and mid-course corrections on the way to the moon.
Well, that really helps answer the question of why is mission control so important. I mean, you're making so many real-time adjustments and calculations for the team that's flying in space at that time. Thinking back on just this, unbelievably legendary number of missions that you worked on and all these different programs, is there a challenge that sticks out in your mind as this was a real tough challenge that you as a team went through, and then how did you approach and solve that?
Oh, well, of course, the immediate thing I guess that comes to mind, the biggest challenge was probably Apollo 13, where we had not really anticipated a failure like that, and therefore had no procedures, no mission rules to cover it. So we just kind of had to make it up as we went along. And that was, if there was ever a time, I think, that proved the worthiness of having a flight control team on the ground to support the spacecraft, it would be Apollo 13, because there's no way they could have gotten back home without us and the 400,000 other people to contractor facilities around the world that supported them.
Well, thank you for surfacing that. That case seems to be a case study for listening and collaboration. And I was wondering what advice you have for folks who are looking to effectively communicate with teams in any kind of work environment today.
Well, be a good listener. So I think is a key to communications, and try to understand what your coworkers, what their job is. Not necessarily enough to go do it yourself, but to understand how what they are doing could impact what you're doing, and also what you're doing, vice versa, what you're doing that could impact their job. I think that's the key to communications. Is you have to understand the role of all of your teammates, and flight control, in my case, flight controllers and astronauts.
That is fantastic advice, and I really appreciate that. The idea of having empathy for what others are doing, understanding their role. And I was curious about something you mentioned in your book. By the way, I'm a fan of your book. I really enjoyed reading it. And there were a couple of passages I wanted to ask you about really quickly. One of them in your book, you mentioned, you're talking about mission control, you said, quote, "This was the real thing. Actions or inactions by the flight controllers could have severe consequences." So I was wondering, Jerry, how do you determine how to take action when you're dealing with so much of this change under pressure?
Well, when bad things happen, of course, we try to, as I have mentioned, we try to anticipate all the bad things and our mission rules, but that wasn't the case, especially in Apollo 13. But when bad things happen, you just have to lay out in your mind all of the options and choose the least risky one, the option, what you think is going to be the most successful, and then proceed one step at a time. I think our training taught us not to try to come up with an immediate solution that's going to solve all the problems that we're facing. In the case of Apollo 13, to get us back to a safe landing site on Earth with nearby recovery forces, just figure out what are all the steps that it takes to get to that point and start executing them one at a time.
It's fantastic advice, the idea of choosing the least risky option, proceeding one step at a time. And that's a really nice segue into another question I had relating to a note in your book. And you mentioned that you worked with the 5 nines at NASA when you were managing risk. In other words, NASA missions targeted a 99.999% reliability by building redundant systems and equipment. So in today's business environment, there's so much conversation around fail fast and innovation, and let's get the content out right away and fix it later. And I was wondering, what's your advice for leaders today who are looking to mitigate and manage risk when things are changing all the time?
Well, again, I think you have to sit down and ahead of time and try to figure out what the risks are, and then what you would do, as we did with missionaries, what you would do if those events really happen. Spaceflight is a risky business. There's no getting around that. But there's a big difference in being risky and being reckless. With risk, you have a well thought out plan and try to mitigate the risk as much as you can, but just don't do reckless things, to try to solve the problem.
Thanks for that. The idea of approaching something and knowing the nuance between an action that's risky versus reckless, that's a great takeaway.
Yeah.
I was curious about the leadership characteristics and qualities necessary to lead the team in mission control. What drove the mission controllers to excel?
Oh my gosh. Well, we had great leaders to start with. We had people like Bob Gilruth, who was the original director of the Manned Spacecraft Center, which became the Johnson Space Center, and Chris Kraft, who was the original flight director and the director of flight operations. And then flight directors that came along like Gene Krantz and Jerry Griffin and Glenn Lunny, who were just great leaders. And there's a difference, I guess, in being a leader and a manager. A manager in most situations tells you what to do and how to do it, or attempts to tell you that. Whereas a leader just says, well, here's the goal, now follow me. And there's a big difference. And I was very fortunate, we all were in the early days of the manned spaceflight program, to have great leaders, not managers, but leaders. You know, a good example of that I think is during the Gemini program, I was in the mission planning division to start with, and I was working on Apollo launch aborts. What we would do during Apollo, during the launch phase, if we had to abort. And Chris Kraft, who was the director of flight operations, called me one day and he said, Bob Gilruth, the center director, wants to hear how we're doing on the launch aborts. And I said, okay, should I do a flip chart presentation or handouts? And there was a little pause and he said, whatever you're comfortable with, you know. He just wants to know how you're doing launch aborts. I said, okay, it'll take me a couple of days to put it together. When do you want to hear it? And there was another long pause. And he said, Bostick, it's Gilruth that wants to hear it. I don't have to hear what you're going to tell him. I trust you. You go tell the man what you're doing. You know? And I was a GS0 at the time, you know. But that kind of trust inspires people to no end. I mean, there was, you know, I left that conversation with, man alive, there's no way that I would ever let that man down.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Absolutely. That follows the follow me. That's a great example of that. And also, it doesn't sound like it's anybody micromanaging, right? You're basically empowered to create your own system and do it your way.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We were very, very fortunate, you know. And then when I went in to see Gilruth, again, I was a zero, just zero, and he was the boss of the whole Johnson Space Center, or what Manned Spacecraft Center, which turned into a Johnson Space Center. Thousands of people and contractors, you know, probably 10,000 people. And he made me feel so comfortable. When I went into his office, he was listening to speaker on this desk, squawk box we call him. He was listening to simulations in the control center. And he said, well, you caught me. He said, I listen to you guys in the control center a lot because I really enjoy it. You know, he said, I would swap jobs with you in a minute. You know, you get to have all the fun in the control center, and all I get to do is sit up here and worry about arguing with NASA headquarters about budgets. So, I mean, how more relaxed could, you know, a man like that make you feel?
Absolutely. It sounds like an ideal working environment where you're working for a leader who's empowering you to make decisions, understands what you're doing, so much so that this person is literally listening to the simulations to learn more about it.
Another good example of that was during the Apollo 13, Thomas Paine, who was a NASA administrator at the time, came down into the control center, and he was up in the viewing room. And so Glenn Lunny, who was on duty as the flight director, and Chuck Dietrich, who's the retrofire officer, and I went with Glenn up into the viewing room and briefed Paine, the administrator, on what had happened and what we were doing. And he had one question at the end. He said, well, that sounds great. Is there anything I can do to help you? Yeah. So, I mean, you know, how, again, you leave a meeting like that with somebody and you say, there's no way I'm going to let that man down.
Absolutely. Yeah, they're trusting you and saying, how can I help you? What do you need?
Yeah.
So thinking of the folks who are listening who'd be curious about your take on what's next for space exploration, I mean, even looking at the patches on your jacket, right? The patches are representing a number of eras of the legendary missions in space exploration. And having seen so many of those phases, what's your hope for the future of space exploration?
To return to the moon as quickly as possible, with no pun intended, I guess, but we barely scratched the surface of the moon. There's so much more to be learned from the minerals on the moon. We have now discovered that there's water there. There's all kinds of things that can be done with the resources on the moon, and we definitely need to go back, set up a base there, and begin to put together from the moon as a launch platform to go to Mars. People are talking now about going directly to Mars. I don't think that's I think that's a waste of time to even think about that. We need to go back to the moon. Getting to Mars, there's a big problem in going to Mars, and that's radiation. And unfortunately, NASA doesn't talk about that a lot because they don't have a solution yet. The only solution now that we have to radiation is lead. And lead shielding is very, very heavy, and would be impossible to shield astronauts to go all the way to Mars. So we got to come up with some solution to radiation.
So aside from the radiation solution, is the moon is establishing another base on the moon also useful to learn how to live off planet for a number of months at a time before going to Mars, which has number of months to get there?
Absolutely, absolutely. It is, it's a great training ground, a great simulation facility, and we can learn so much about living in that kind of an environment before we seriously start planning to go to Mars. It's just a key element. I can't believe that everybody doesn't believe that, and we're planning on doing it immediately. I think that it's going to happen. It's most likely it would be expensive, and it's doubtful that the United States, with today's environment, would be able to foot the bill all by themselves. So it's going to involve other countries, potentially Russia and China even, and also commercial companies. But I think that's good. I welcome anybody who wants to get on the train and take us back to the moon.
Absolutely. And thinking of the cooperation that would be required, public and private and globally, with countries from all around the world participating, I would think that would be gifted to the next generation, who would be empowered to not only get us there, but keep us there, I would think. And I was curious, for the younger learners who are watching this, what would be your advice for students who are dreaming of a career in any job in space exploration?
Well, I think they should think about, all of the different possibilities, all the different aspects of it, and pursue the one that interests them the most. Could it be mission planning? Could it be control center operations, the flight controllers, or simulation people, or astronauts? It's a wide variety of activities are areas that one could pursue, and I think they ought to think about which one of those would be most comfortable in, and pursue it. And again, if along the way they change their mind, go to another field. Nothing wrong with that.
Absolutely. Going back to the early point about switching your goals, and that's completely fine. And I was curious, on a personal level, what are you most excited and proud of? Looking back at the countless missions that you worked on and all the accomplishments, is there something that stands out where you say, that was pretty cool?
Apollo 8. I was, along with a handful of other people, was tasked by George Lowe, who was the Apollo program manager at the time, and Chris Kraft, the director of flight operations. I think there were 4 of us who were tasked to begin working on sending the next flight after Apollo 7, which would be the first flight of the brand new hardware command and service module after the fire. To actually, if Apollo 7 was successful, to take the next mission to the moon. And when I first heard about that from Dr. Kraft, I said, that's the craziest thing I ever heard. And he said, yes, that's what I told George Lowe when he first asked me about it. But don't think that. This was on a Friday afternoon. He said, think about it over the weekend and come back Monday morning. You know, you got 2 whole days here to figure it out. So come back and tell me if we can do it or not. And that was another example, I guess, of somebody putting so much trust in you that, you know, you want to make sure that you do the right thing. But we went back, the 4 of us, I guess, and on Monday and said, yes, we can do it with these limitations. You know, we won't have all the displays that we want in the control center, but we can do a lot of the work in the office wing of the control center and the mission planning and analysis division and what was called our auxiliary computer room. And again, we can do it. We won't have everything we want, but we can do it and not take any undue risk. So he said, okay, pursue that, but you can't tell anybody, you know, what you're working on. And Glenn Laney was my boss at the time, and I couldn't even tell it, you know, talk to him about it. But he figured it out, you know, being the smartest Glenn was. He figured it out. I found out recently that I was working on it, on Apollo 8, about 3 months before Jim Lovell, who was the command module pilot on the flight, before he even knew about it himself. So, you know, that was quite an experience. You know, groundbreaking. And another case where, you know, the bosses put so much trust in you that there was no way you were going to let them down. So Apollo 8 is still my favorite mission. People say, well, gosh, I'm surprised it's not Apollo 11. Well, yes, I'm very proud of Apollo 11. But Apollo 8, we baked the cake, okay? We figured out it could be done. Here's what you had to do. Did everything except land. And then on 11, we did the landing, and that put the icing on the cake.
Love that metaphor that you baked the cake on Apollo 8. That's really cool. And how empowering to get that assignment on a Friday and to come back on a Monday to have that very quick diagnosis. Can you do this? And then that set up the systems and the table for Apollo 8.
Yep. Yeah.
That's amazing.
Will always be my favorite mission.
Thank you so much. What's that?
It was bold and it was very rewarding. You know, it turned out that it was a very successful mission. Of course, highlighted by Borman reading from the Bible on Christmas Eve. I don't know how you can get more excited about something than that.
That's a legendary piece of history in our recorded history. That and you know, the photos that were accompanied with that. I mean, that specific mission is in the vernacular of world history as one of the most important events.
Yeah.
That is incredible. Jerry, on a personal level, it's been a real honor getting to chat with you. I want to be very respectful of your time, and thank you, just so generous of your time. Thank you so much for joining us. Is there anything else that you wanted to share with anybody who might be watching in terms of advice or takeaways?
No, my main thing is, as I said before, let's go back to the moon. Okay,